I hope everybody can hear me. Okay, great. Welcome everyone to our latest virtual panel brought to you by the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. My name is Natalie Nieves and I am the NAHJ New York City Secretary, and I'm also an associate producer at CBS News covering national news. Today we'll take a look at the last 6 months of coronavirus news coverage in New York City. COVID-19 has become one story that we're all following on a global level. And that's unprecedented in today's world of quick clicks and daily breaking news. As working journalists, we're forced to consider the techno-social systems currently in place that are obviously not around during, let's say, prior pandemics, such as the Spanish flu. New York has been especially hard hit, and at one point was the epicenter of the virus here in the United States. Before I introduce our panelists today, I would like to thank the NAHJ New York City Board for all their help in putting this together. The NAHJ New York City President Keldy Ortiz, our treasurer Deyanira Martinez, and also NAHJ Board member Monica Castillo. I would also like to thank Jujen Bonaparte for coordinating. Thank you so much. So yes, now we can go ahead and introduce our panelists. I'm just gonna say their name, a very brief bio, and they're gonna say hey on screen. We're gonna start in no particular order with Sonia Rincon. So Sonia's a reporter and anchor for 1010 Wins, which is New York's all news radio station. She loves telling stories of the city she grew up in her 13 years at 1010 Wins. Sonia has also covered stories for WABC TV, WCBS TV, News 12 The Bronx, and she's also taught at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism in CUNY. Sonia, please say hello to everyone.
Hi, Natalie, thank you very much. Love to be here.
Thanks for being here. Okay, now Claudia, I know you just told me, Claudia Isere. I'm so sorry, I'm terrible, but Claudia covers Brooklyn for The City, a nonprofit newsroom in New York City that covers local news in the public interest. Her reporting has appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. She's also written for City Limits and Latino News. She is also a recipient of the Sidney Hillman Foundation Award for social justice reporting. Claudia, say hello to everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for everything, Natalie.
Thank you. And last but not least, Jonelle Marte. She writes about economy and the Federal Reserve for Reuters. During the pandemic, she has written about the delays jobless Americans have faced while receiving unemployment benefits, the struggles of small businesses trying to secure aid, and how job losses have disproportionately hit women, particularly single moms. Before Reuters, Jonelle wrote about consumer finances for the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, and we're very happy to have you here, Jonelle. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Great. I just want to say, unfortunately, Eliezer Marte is unable to join us this evening. He has a prior commitment, but we hope to see him on a future panel. Okay, great. Thank you all for joining us tonight. If you're watching at home and you have any questions, please be sure to put them into the chat function, and we'll ask them at the end of the panel. Okay, now to dive right in, tell us, each of you, whoever wants to go first, can just tell us about a particular story that you've covered in the last 6 months since coronavirus has hit the US. I know the first case was reported back in January out of Washington, and then slowly our first case here in New York State occurred in March. But you all work for different, obviously news orgs, and some of you different mediums. So it'd be interesting to see which story you have personally covered that kind of really delineated the impact that coronavirus would have, and really drove home what a major story it would be here in New York State or New York City. So whoever wants to go.
I can go first.
Okay, great.
For me, what really had an impact was that PPE shortage at the beginning of the crisis in New York, when it was mid and late March, and when nurses and healthcare workers were outside their hospitals protesting and saying, we only get one N95 mask for a week and we need one a day. And the fact that they had to ask for that, and just hearing that in their voices, with radio, obviously it's all audio. So hearing that desperation from them and talking to them on the phone and even covering it in person with a long boom mic and trying to stand 6 feet away with masks. And there were so many unknowns then, but the PPE shortage was so scary and so real at the time. And for healthcare workers to not have just the basic PPE that they needed, and for them to be out protesting when they needed to be inside caring for their patients. But it was so important for them to go and get that message out to the public because it was so urgent. That really, really drove it home for me, covering some of those protests.
Absolutely, very powerful. Claudia or Janelle, do either of you have a story?
I can go next. For me, in terms of coronavirus coverage, what really stuck out for me and what I really sought out from the get-go was how the pandemic was really going to exacerbate, or at least bring to light, for a lot of folks, the social inequality issues in the city, in particular for Latinos in the city and for folks who are undocumented or families that are, mixed status household families. A couple of the first questions that came to mind when the pandemic started and the lockdown was announced was, how are undocumented folks going to get stimulus checks? How are they going to qualify for welfare? How is the social safety net going to expand to support these families and these individuals? How are frontline workers, Latinos and of course a lot of Black people and African Americans in New York City occupy a lot of the jobs deemed essential. Like we're talking about custodial workers, janitors, taxi drivers, grocery store workers, warehouse workers, and how, this was going to have an impact on those communities in the short and long term. And that was something that, unfortunately, I feel that like a lot of advocates really wanted to see more support for these communities. And we're really hoping that the social safety net would expand in order for these families to get the support that they needed at the state and the city level. And it is something that we're going to, it's a story that will keep going long after the pandemic is over, and that the city will be reckoning with for long after the pandemic is over.
So for me, tagging on to what Claudia was talking about, I write about things from the economic side, right? So following, especially in New York in the beginning, the challenges that people face with getting access to unemployment benefits. And, that was one of the main storylines for me at the start, because you don't have work, you don't have a paycheck. And for many people, they were going weeks or months, and some people are still waiting for that. Now, of course, it's worse in other parts of the country, I think now, but I do think that the challenges, the anxiety that people are facing, not only the health crisis, right? My family, like not me, but like people whose families were directly affected by this, and then they couldn't work. And then as well, looking at the inequality component of it, it was a lot of workers of color, Latino, Black workers, women in particular. That was another storyline that I followed, which was the types of jobs that were lost were jobs that were disproportionately held by women, held by immigrants, held by women of color. And those are the people who are least prepared to deal with a prolonged period of joblessness, because of the fact that wages are low, and because of the fact that they have a harder time saving, may have harder access to things like unemployment benefits or loans or other programs. I do think that's been, for me personally, one of the most important things to keep reporting on, is looking at who was hit the hardest, how they were least equipped to deal with this, and what resources have been made available to them.
I feel like a common thread in a lot of the stories that you each discussed have been a lack of a social safety network for specific groups, whether it be a hospital employee, nurses, doctors, or Latinos and Black people that are essential workers or deemed essential workers and have to continue to go out to provide for their families. And I think it ties in perfectly with my next question, which is, obviously the pandemic has disproportionately affected Latinx and Black people across the US, and specifically New York City. How has your coverage more or less reflected those stories of those people? Whoever wants to take it.
I can jump right ahead. I feel that like in my outlet, the city, this is something that we held in very, like, this is really important for us to be able to cover kind of like all the intersections of how this pandemic and all the fallout was going to affect all the different communities. And for me personally, in terms of covering how this would affect the Latino community and how this did affect and is affecting the Latino community, was focusing precisely on the industries and, in the labor groups and the sections of society, where Latinos are employed, where Latinos live in New York City, the different neighborhoods and the areas where Latinos live, and how people were surviving and reacting to the virus from there. And that meant covering, the cleaners who were on the front line of this virus, custodial workers and janitors who were working in hospitals, who were working in train stations, domestic workers who were now out of work. It meant reaching out to organizations who tallied that, half of undocumented immigrants in New York City became unemployed because of the pandemic. The vast majority of them undocumented and therefore ineligible for a lot of the social welfare benefits and like the social safety networks that, would otherwise be awarded if not for their citizenship status. And, the intersections of all of that.
And just to continue, so of course, I mentioned a few of the stories, right? Looking at women, how they were hit hard. Another main area that hasn't come up yet that I've been writing about has to do with the small businesses, minority-owned businesses, and how they are shutting down at a much faster rate when you look at other small businesses. So Black, for example, more than 40% of Black-owned businesses have been shut down because of the crisis. And that compares to, let's say, 16 or 17% of white-owned small businesses, right? So that has been another thread of coverage for me, because we're talking about really small businesses. A lot of times it's just the only employee is the owner of the business. And it's been very difficult for minority-owned businesses to survive for a number of reasons. They already were likely to have less resources on hand. And when the programs came around, like the Paycheck Protection Program, you're talking about businesses that probably did not have loans in the past, did not have existing banking relationships, and couldn't get the money right away. Especially the first round of the PPP program was first come, first serve. And a lot of minority-owned businesses were not able to get in on that first round. And even now, a lot of businesses that I talk to, they're really concerned about getting those funds, or they don't know how to get the funds. They apply and they don't have the coaching that they might need. It's a disadvantage, again, not having the existing relationships and not having someone there to walk you through the process. And so then what? Then you shut down, and the longer you're shut down, the harder it is to come back from something like this. So that's another big thing to keep an eye on, because small businesses employ a lot of people, and a lot of people of color who own these businesses, that is their only way to make money, right? So I think it's something to keep watching.
I was just thinking about covering sort of the evolution of the test and trace program that the city has in place now. And one of the most urgent things it had to do was to be able to quarantine people who from their own families, which is something very hard when we live in such a dense city, and when working families live a lot of people to an apartment, live in a 2-bedroom apartment with several people, or even a 1-bedroom apartment with lots of family members. And where the more vulnerable family members were the ones getting sick, because these are working families of essential workers. And that was such a problem for such a long time. And one thing that, as the test and trace program sort of developed, was to come up with a way to give people a safe place to quarantine away from their families, but still be in touch with their families. And that clearly had to be a priority, because that was how so many people were getting sick, because essential workers who are members of families and people of color and in working class neighborhoods were going out and bringing the virus home.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing. That does lead into my next question about futures. What are the next stories that you see coming out of New York City? When I first introduced the panel, I mentioned that this is a global story. There's one story happening right now, and it's the coronavirus. How has the pandemic affected your reporting, your beat, your coverage? I feel like we've all had to quickly scramble and become experts in policy or health or healthcare that aren't necessarily aligned with our original beats or stories that you may be interested in covering. So I just want to hear about what resources have you personally found, either independently from your newsroom, that are helpful to your coverage of the pandemic. I want to be very conscientious that listeners and watchers of this panel are journalists and are also interested in kind of sharing information, how we find it. Also, what kind of changes to your workflow have you implemented? We're not living in an age of meeting up with a source over coffee, right? So how do you find stories during a pandemic, essentially?
I can go first. That's been such a challenge. It has been really hard to not be able to put a microphone in someone's face and to get nice, clean audio, and to have to cover things over Zoom where the audio is not as clear, where you don't get to just ask a question, and to have to interview people over the phone or over FaceTime. And it's just not as personal. And I feel like I don't, not just the audio quality, but just the quality of the conversation and the interaction with people. I feel like that's been really hard for radio to adapt to. There's some press conferences that are, I don't cover the mayor's briefings every day, but I think he still doesn't have in-person briefings. And I know that's been challenging for the reporters who cover those. So that just having to adapt technologically and I'm out on the street. I don't like working from home was just completely alien because like, how do I do that? I just had to interview people over the phone, which is something that we kind of tried to stay away from unless it was absolutely necessary because I couldn't get to the person. So that's continues to be a challenge.
For me, I'm used to interviewing people over the phone because we have a very national audience. So even though I'm based in New York, that doesn't mean I don't write about something that's happening in California or that I'm not talking to people who live elsewhere, right? So I'm used to that. Of course, one thing we can't do is before, if I had something that was really kind of based in a certain location, I would go, and now I don't get to go. It's, whatever we can find out over the phone, or if we have a photographer over there. In terms of looking for stories that, ever since this, I write about the economy, we're in an economic crisis. So now there's so much to do. The stories are everywhere for me. It's just a matter of figuring out which ones to do first and finding other people to take on some of the stories that I can't get to, because if we wait too long, then someone else is going to do it or the moment will pass. So in that respect, we have a lot to write about in terms of the jobs market, access to benefits, and what's happening now with policy in Congress and how quickly they're going to respond.
For me, it was kind of a mixed bag, I will admit. I mean, adjusting to working from home and just life in the pandemic, I think is hard no matter what you do, because what we all went through in the city and what we're going through right now worldwide is absolutely nuts. It's crazy, and it's a lot to deal with. And I would say that for me, in terms of finding stories and finding and speaking to sources and all that, in a lot of ways with the pandemic, it was just a constant stream of people reaching out to me, emailing me, texting me out of the blue, people I had never spoken to before in extremely desperate situations, and people who were really just starving for information. Why can't I get tested? Where can I isolate if I live with 7 people in my 2-bedroom apartment? Why can't I find masks? Why can't I find gloves? And it was kind of like recalibrating my reporting into just kind of like being kind of like on that, you know, kind of like metabolism of not really just cranking out stories, but really kind of like shifting to like really being a service. I feel like that's what this pandemic really came to, like what this pandemic really forced into focus for me, is that what we're doing is a public service. And it's not just about having a good story and like bringing issues to light that people deserve to know about and that deserve attention, but also being a service and being a source of information for people is really important and a crucial part of the job. That said, you know, working from home, really hard. The first couple months of the pandemic, I found it extraordinarily difficult to kind of unplug. And I started feeling a little burnt out, which I guess we all were, I think it's safe to say. But it was because of that, you know, urgency of the issue. And it felt and it feels very gratifying to ask, you know, tough questions on behalf of New Yorkers. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm just gonna quickly get to a few questions we've been asked by people watching. As a reminder, if you have any questions, be sure to post them. The first one is from Talia Juarez, and she asks, what themes or topics related to COVID-19 do you feel are not being covered enough at a local level?
I felt like it was really hard to get a real true grasp on what was going on inside hospitals, just for obvious reasons. I mean, safety, privacy. And so when we did get some of those big stories from out of Elmhurst Hospital and some of the other hospitals that were really overwhelmed, those were just eye-opening. And, you know, if there is a second wave, or if this happens again somehow, I would hope that there would be, that we will have more sources in those hospitals and in those sectors where we can really get a better grasp on what's going on and really hear those stories. And I feel like so many of those stories are going to come out later, and it's important to know about them when they're happening too. So that's something I felt like we need to get better at.
Absolutely. If Janelle, Claudia, I don't want to overstep. Do you want me to ask the next question, or do either of you have anything to add?
Sure. I might just want to add to what Sonia said, you know, just speaking about hospitals. I think that another thing that I feel that at the local level we could be better at is like really driving home and like really uncovering, you know, what got us to this point. And, you know, why wasn't New York as adequately prepared? And why were these shortages in hospitals? And the fact of the matter is that it's been years of this investment in these resources that are necessary for folks and that are safety net services for our most vulnerable neighbors. I feel that, you know, there's a lot of work to be done in that respect, and really showing, you know, kind of like the long-winded ways in which this was a crisis in the making, you know, even before we knew there was a pandemic, and how the city and how the state was not prepared to something that was deemed inevitable many months before it started.
Absolutely. Thank you. Lisa Kovitz asks, with the additional 600 unemployment benefit about to end, how are you planning to cover that impact that'll have? Also, it's up against a lack of childcare if someone does get a job or receive employment. And I feel like Janelle would be the best person to kind of talk about this. I'm going to toss it over.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking too. I'm glad that people are interested in this, because it's something I spend a lot of time thinking about it. Even on my days off, I'm thinking through, okay, well, how is this going to play out in the economy and for families? And what are the things that we really need to be writing about that we haven't gotten to yet? You know, at the beginning of the month or at the end of June, we did pull together a story that shows that was really focusing on like families and how worried they were about July, because unemployment benefits are on the cusp of being cut in more than half, plus all of the things that are going away right now with rent payments, a moratorium on evictions, housing mortgage payments that many people have had those payments deferred up until now. So, you know, I focused the story on a family in Hawaii, of all places, I guess, but, you know, Hawaii was really hard hit because it's so heavily, you know, focused on the tourism industry over there. So it was a family, for example, that they both worked for hotels, they're both out of work for months, and even had to wait a very long time to collect those unemployment benefits, like I said. So, you know, walking through readers, the anxiety, you don't know when the money's gonna come in. Then it comes in, and what happens? People save the money. This woman was saving the checks because she's thinking, I have 2 kids, I don't know, but these benefits are gonna be cut, and, you know, she's expecting them to be reduced. I have 2 kids, I have a mortgage. I can't just sit and wait. And then, you know, I think I'm planning to follow that family because they're in one of the hardest hit industries. And the choices that they have to make are the choices that a lot of families will have to make if we figure out what it is that Congress is going to deliver. And it's stuff that comes into play in spending. You know, I've written a little bit about how families that got these checks, according to some studies, they spent more once the money came in than they did beforehand, because, you know, these are low wage jobs, and having the supplement allowed people to keep paying the rent. That's another thing. People have been able to pay by and large up until now. And these are the things to watch: rent payments, what happens, spending on groceries, spending on other things. Because if you're not sure, like this woman is not sure of what's coming, you're going to save rather than spend. So that's all stuff that ripples across the economy. Let's see, what else? Yeah, childcare, exactly. Well, I've already written about women being hit disproportionately by the job losses, and now it's, are they able to get back to work, especially single moms that were hit even harder than a lot of other demographics. You know, so what's going to happen to women in the workforce going forward, career options? Those are the kind of things that I'm going to be writing about, and welcome any ideas.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jonelle. I didn't mean to toss it directly to her. Claudia, Sonia, if either of you have any input, I'd be thrilled to hear it.
I mean, yeah, I agree with everything Janelle said. I think another subject that I have been covering so far, and I'm definitely going to be looking ahead, looking at, you know, as Janelle mentioned, the impact of the economy and the housing instability crisis, is homelessness. You know, New York already had a homelessness crisis long before this pandemic started. 1 in 10 children in the New York City public school system are homeless. An estimated 60,000 homeless New Yorkers, you know, reside in the city right now. And, you know, a lot of housing experts, tenant lawyers, social workers, and people who kind of work in all aspects of the social safety net do expect this issue to worsen as a result of the pandemic and people not being able to make rent or, support their livelihood. And it's a subject that I've been covering so far throughout the pandemic from the very beginning. And it's something that I think it's going to be kind of like the subject once the pandemic is over.
Great, thank you, Claudia. I'm gonna ask another question here. How do you use your reporting to stay relevant on a topic that's changing every day, every week? How are each of you, what systems have you guys implemented ever since the start of the pandemic, and how quickly it's developed to kind of stay on top of it, especially, you know, we're talking April when things are really, you know, picking up.
I mean, in general terms, social media, just yeah. Kind of using that barometer every day and just diving right in and seeing what, not just what's being reported, but people's personal stories and what's bothering them, what's concerning them. I mean, the fact that masks right now are such a dominant topic on social media and such a political debate is, you know, kind of crazy, but that's what people are talking about right now. I think, I think I've been using social media more as an observer now than ever before.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, Sonia. There's so much there, and it's a tool that we haven't had in the past. Like I mentioned, prior pandemics, we don't see it happening in real time on our news feed as we're doom scrolling, as some people say.
Yes.
I saw, Janelle, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was gonna say that I agree with that. I mean, I have certain terms that I just keep an open search on my like tweet deck because you never know. I want to know what people are saying about unemployment benefits, for example, as well. Looking before at the stimulus checks, just to get a pulse of like how quickly are they arriving, or are people really struggling? I mean, you get a lot out of social media. There are some limitations because you don't get everything there, but I do find it really helpful. And people are very willing to talk about what they're going through. You'd be surprised the things that people will tweet about. And that's as well how I find a lot of people who I'm able to quote in my story as to how they're doing financially, because they're finding community online and they're sharing their experience, and then you can learn from that and also get them to tell you more about what it's been like for them. Oh, I was also going to add that this is a fast-changing story, as you said, Natalie, and what happens to me a lot is I might be talking to a mom or another worker, someone who's waiting on an unemployment check, and I don't know exactly what story they're going to be in. I develop a report with them, and then maybe the story that I had in mind, they're not good for that one. But down the line, something else, there's a new development in the economy, a new change as to, okay, this is what they're going to do for unemployment benefits, or, you're still waiting. Okay. So then it's like, oh, moms are losing jobs at a high rate. So people you just talk to that are being really affected by this, you may not know right away what story they're going to be good for, but eventually, you come back to them for something later on because you remember, oh, that person was in that situation. So that's one thing I try to do is I try to talk to as many people as I can when I have a set story, and then the people who don't fit for that story, just keep them in the in the notebook or in Google Doc or wherever it is you keep your notes, and just check in on them little by little when you can, and then when something comes up, they might be the perfect person to illustrate that other thing you're writing about. And having the people, it's not about getting a good story, it's about writing the story in a way that really resonates with people and draws attention to the issue that you're talking about, so that policymakers can really understand what it is that they have to address.
On that note, with what Janelle just said, I feel that, like, just kind of repeat to the question that, what I try to do to keep my reporting relevant, as kind of like the person who asked the question said, is exactly that. It's reaching out to experts, whether it's public health experts, social workers, social science experts, policymakers, data analysts, and also just to kind of like get their perspective on what is being done, what should be done, and what could be improved upon, and what is being done right. But also kind of reading a lot and like researching kind of like on a solutions-based mind of what other cities, other jurisdictions, and other countries have done right in a way that could be replicable in New York, or is relevant to New Yorkers, and how the communities themselves have reacted to this crisis. The people who have set up mutual aid groups, the people who are organizing their building, to get, rights as tenants. I feel like a lot of that is really powerful and relevant to the story, and it's just one of many, many, many ways to illustrate what's been going on.
Thank you, Claudia. I really like that, thinking ahead and kind of seeing, the far-reaching effects and impacts. One of my questions, as reporters that have, written about a story or created stories around the former epicenter, what advice would you give to journalists that are not covering, let's say, Florida, Texas, California, other major cities that are now being very hard hit by the pandemic? What advice would you impart, or what do you wish you knew going into covering, the epicenter of the pandemic here in New York City? Like, what would you like to share with you know, anyone like, hey, this is some advice, or this is an easy way to kind of organize your thoughts or your stories?
That's a great question. I think Claudia kind of touched on this a little bit. Seeing what neighborhoods and what small communities are within neighborhoods are saying, whether it's a building organizing or whether I'm thinking of like those neighborhood Facebook pages, which in New York are really, I mean, they're full of stories. So, you know, just hearing what people are concerned about and then consulting an expert as to why this is happening or what might be driving this. But seeing kind of that real local, hyper local, if you will, that chatter, what's concerning people in a particular area. It's something that's alarming because it's different, because it's new, because it's unfamiliar, because it's scary, and taking it from there, and then trying to figure out from the experts why.
Yeah, I would say adding to what Sonia said, just exactly that. Like, especially if you're a local reporter and you cover, you know, like any local, like specific neighborhood or area within your city or your state, I think like the same kind of rules for any kind of journalism or any story apply, which is let your audience, let your community guide you and like hold your hand and show you to what you should be covering and how you should be covering it. And just in terms of what issues you should cover and how you should cover them, you should just, you know, follow your gut, keep holding power to account, keep highlighting both the good and the bad going in communities and how people are coming together, you know, in these really difficult times to kind of like confront this virus. And yeah, just follow your gut.
I feel like that's really great advice, especially with Facebook groups and Twitter, you know, providing stories. All of us at some point or another have worked from home or are still working from home. So that's a way to still access community, right? We can see that on Twitter, on Facebook, on any kind of social media sites. And they always are full of stories. That's totally correct. There's a question from Raymond Mora. I love this pivot. How difficult is it to say to yourself, hey, I need a break from work? I need to take a walk outside of my mind. So yeah, how have each of you kind of handled that self-care aspect while still reporting the important stories?
I can go first. I mean, especially like the two other panelists have mentioned in the beginning, when this was all coming down, it was very difficult to step away because the urgency is there, and you're thinking like you're writing about people, or I was writing about people who didn't have money to pay anything, buy food or the rent or pay for the rent, or just didn't know what was coming next. So you just feel this sense of duty, and it's, you know, it's why we are in this field, right? Like we want to help people, we want to write stories that matter. So it's hard. It's hard to step away. I mean, I think with time, thankfully things are a little bit better here in New York, but I mean, the issues that I write about are still urgent. So it comes and goes based on, for me, like right now, obviously Congress is having to make some decisions pretty soon in the next couple of days. So once again, it's like picked up again, and you feel like you have to work extra hard. I mean, I always work hard, but you know what I mean? Like there's just even more pressure. So I haven't quite figured it out. I mean, my job is pretty good about reminding people to disconnect. So I would say probably, if anything, that's my tip is like, make sure to take a day off here and there, even if you're not going anywhere, just because you need it.
I will say I don't feel awkward or bad about taking a day off here and there either, just because right now no one's going on vacation. So there's no shortage of part-time or freelance reporters to grab that shift, because they're going to want it, because no one's really going away for extended periods of time right now. So it's really people just taking a day off here and there to just chill and decompress. And a lot of people in every role of the newsroom have had to do that, just, you know, a day here and a day there. And there's always someone who wants to grab that shift because no one's covering for anyone vacationing. So that's been reassuring, just knowing that I'm not gonna, you know, leave anyone high and dry.
For me, it was kind of a rough adjustment. I'll admit that I was not all that good at that self-care stuff for the first 2 months of the pandemic. Like, I feel that, and I don't know if this is the same for you, Janelle, Sonia, and Natalie, but like at the beginning, you know, I'm working from home all day and there's really nothing else for you to do. So for me, it was like I would wake up first thing in the morning, I would grab my laptop, start working, and I wouldn't stop until 12, 14 hours later. And it was really long days, long weeks, no rest on weekends as well. And I really just reached a point where I was like, this is not sustainable. And it was just a matter of really setting a routine for myself, having those couple hours in the morning right after I wake up just to myself and no screen time, you know. And, you know, if I am committed to working 8 to 10 hours on that day, like on any regular work day, just knowing when to like unplug and shut down, taking a couple hours to yourself, stretch, eating right, exercising, getting your steps in. It was a trial and error, and it took a lot of effort to kind of like have that discipline, especially because this is such an important story. And it's not something, like, it's something that in many ways is happening to us as well. So it's really personal. But long story short, it was just a matter of kind of like setting discipline and like really being, you know, strict with myself and knowing what my limits are. And
Absolutely. I feel like, thank you all for sharing kind of what you all do for self-care, because I think it's incredibly valuable as journalists who are always plugged in and bombarded with a lot of information on any given day. I feel like writing an article or reporting a story is doing a mini research project in the span of an hour or two, depending on your deadlines. So it's really important that people kind of talk about that and take a step back to reassess, take a breather, take a walk. That's great. I'm going to ask this question from Christopher Alvarez now. This is directed at Janelle, but obviously Sonia and Claudia, please feel free to answer it as well. And he asks, have you addressed the possible concern of inflation going up given the abundance of stimulus checks? And I believe you kind of touched upon this earlier in the panel, but go ahead and ask that.
Thanks for asking. So I write about the Federal Reserve. So inflation is a big point of focus for them, because they have two goals. They have to keep inflation stable, and they have to achieve maximum employment in the labor market. And even though spending has gone up for the people who are receiving unemployment benefits, spending overall is still somewhat depressed because of the nature of what's going on right now. There's not as much to do. Like, even if you have your job, you're not traveling as much. The spas are closed or whatever it is, you know, a lot of places, movie theaters, theater, concerts, just spending overall is down. And so that is something that people at the Federal Reserve are watching and are saying, like, actually they're concerned more about disinflation because of that, you know, and even people who have the unemployment benefits, they're worried about how long is it going to last, and the uncertainty of it all is affecting spending patterns and making people more conservative in some cases. So saving is actually way up, and you know, that's something that the Fed is keeping an eye on. They don't want prices, they don't want disinflationary pressures. They want there to be very modest inflation at around 2%. And I mean, most of the people there are saying that they're more concerned about not having enough inflation than about having too much inflation. And it's something that even before this happened and the economy was really strong, normally when you have low unemployment, you have some inflationary pressures. You know, people start to make more money, and they start to that starts to affect prices. But really, it didn't play out that way, and it's a bit of a mystery. I mean, part of it is as well like low wages and companies not offering higher wages. But all of that being said, we all know that there are certain things that are getting more expensive, even if it's not showing up on the national inflation figures. And I think food is one of the big ones that people are watching, especially because we've all been spending more money at the grocery store. So it's something to keep in mind. I think some people are calling attention to that. And we'll see what happens at the end with what Congress does and with what the spending patterns are. But so far, not too much inflation showing up.
I'm not going to do it to you, Sonia and Claudia. I'm going to go ahead and ask the next question from April Joyner, which is very interesting and something I'm a little bit curious about as well. It's been interesting that the coronavirus story has intersected with a big reckoning regarding racial justice. And there have been many stories addressing both, which we have discussed also how, coronavirus has disproportionately affected brown, Black, and women, people of color here in New York. Do you have any concerns about the intersectional coverage dropping off as the months go by?
I can jump right in. I have a short answer and a long answer for that. My short answer is no, because I think that unfortunately, we're going to have a second wave of this pandemic in a couple months when the flu season kicks back in. So this isn't a story that is dying off or dropping off anytime soon, unfortunately. My long answer is, that, as that second wave, kicks in, and as the long-term effects of this pandemic play out in the years and generations to come, really, it is going to be communities of color, Black communities, African-American communities, immigrant communities, Latino communities, women, working families that are going to be disproportionately affected and who are disproportionately affected. And I think that that's a matter of fact that you cannot divorce from the issue, and that we would in fact be doing a disservice by dropping off that intersection. I feel like there's no way to discuss COVID without addressing those issues. I don't even know, especially in the city of New York, how you would be able to cover coronavirus without talking about those things and without addressing those things. So I personally don't see it dropping off. What I would like to see is to see it improve and to see it increase across all local and even national media.
I don't see it dropping off either, and that is because we have an election coming up in the fall, and these issues are so front and center. So certainly short term, I see these issues staying front and center.
I think you both have a good point. I don't see how it would drop off in the near future, but I do think that at some point, maybe a year from now, things are going to start to look better, and we won't necessarily remember that it was women who lost their jobs first and foremost, and low-wage workers who were hit the hardest. Maybe, you know what I mean? It's going to fade. But I have to keep pressure on myself too when the time comes. Hopefully, if we're lucky that things get better, right? And the urgency, you would hope, will fade. But I do think we need to still continue to write about, well, why was it that these were the groups that were hit the hardest? And why did Congress have to step in and add $600 a week to the unemployment benefits program? What are the holes there? Have they been plugged permanently? This crisis has pointed to so many holes in the safety net, as Natalie mentioned. It's the unemployment benefits and how hard they are to access. It's healthcare, who has it, who can take a day off when they're not feeling well, and it goes on. And Congress came in and patched up the safety net, but what about the next crisis? What about as things fade but continue? Because we don't know how long this is going to last. I think we should continue to put pressure on that, and we have to remind ourselves to continue to do that kind of analysis.
Absolutely. I know Sonia, Claudia, you're both local reporters. Janelle covers national news. So I feel like New York City can be a bubble, right? And even more so if you're quarantining, you're on lockdown, essentially, you have to stay in place. What are some issues that you've had to struggle with in fair and accurate coverage of the pandemic here in New York City without having access to how other, cities or states are dealing with it? One example I have is I was actually traveling in mid-March. I was in El Salvador on a reporting trip. And this was when President Trump made his announcement that flights coming in from certain areas of Europe would be banned from entering the US. And we were in El Salvador, but still out of caution, we decided to head back to our countries of origin. It was an international trip. And when I was leaving, it was March 12th, I believe. Everyone in the El Salvador International Airport, tiny airport, everyone had a mask. Everyone had, those temperature checkers, and I was checked 3 different times, just randomly, random intervals, before being screened, luggage screening, afterwards, before getting on the plane, my temperature was taken, and I would get a little sticker to indicate that my temperature had been taken and it was safe for me to pass through. I was also asked questions, and I thought it was funny because I thought he was making conversation. He's like, "Oh, have you been to Italy?" And I'm like, "No, but I want to. The pasta's great." And I was like, "Oh, you're asking because of the virus. You're not asking because you're curious." And it's just little things that I wasn't used to, having to deal with. I land in JFK. There isn't a single employee wearing a mask in sight. No one took my temperature. None of the flight attendants had on face masks or coverings. And as I'm leaving, one random person, people kind of crowd around to wait for their families. One person said in Spanish, "Hey, there's hand sanitizer over there. Aren't you gonna sanitize before you leave the airport?" And I thought that was my welcome to New York. Like, we're kind of watching each other's backs because there are no systems in place at that point to kind of protect one another. So that's what I mean by a bubble. I mean, if I hadn't traveled from El Salvador here, I wouldn't have known that, that government reacted so quickly and implemented face masks and already had the supplies to give their airports, at least, to check people's temperature. So yeah, however you guys want to interpret or answer that question, I'd be very interested.
I can jump ahead. I think one thing that I've been doing to kind of like address how, the virus reaction in other cities, even in the US or in other countries, is just kind of reading up on what's been going on. And again, like consulting experts. I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but I think that like as journalists, we're always, curious and nosy and, just, trying to figure out just creative solutions and just like what everyone else is doing in ways that can be replicable here. Or I always struggle with saying that word. But yeah, I feel like a big part of it, given that we can't, because of the pandemic, we can't always have that lived experience like you had, where you were like at that airport and you were able to compare and contrast that deferring experience, or like travel to a different state and see how things are going over there. It's like really important to just like stay informed. And always be sourcing, and, just consulting people in your own Rolodex and reading magazines and national outlets, etc., and just trying to figure out what everyone else is doing. And also, this is the case, for me, like I have family in Puerto Rico. I'm from there originally. And so in a lot of ways, like my whole family still lives there. And so throughout the pandemic, it was just like this thing of like constantly having to like compare and contrast what is being done here versus there. And I feel like that's something that a lot of Latinos and a lot of us who are maybe first generation or maybe immigrants also kind of like have that kind of like dual experience in a situation like this. And I feel like that can be an enormous asset in reporting on this issue. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
No, absolutely. Very well said.
I think one way that has, that the bubble has sort of affected me in a way is that in New York, we were hit so hard. Like we saw how quiet it got. We heard the sirens, and I'm sure a lot of us know people who passed away from it or were very sick from it. And I think even though things are opening up, there's still like some cautiousness. People wear masks more or less, right? And it's like takes like talking to family and friends in other parts of the country to remember or to think about and get a perspective that those same measures were never taken or were not taken for nearly as long as they were here. And so as we write about people's consumer habits or spending habits or cautiousness, it's a, you know, that's why we need to talk about to people, well, for me in other places around the country, because you have to be reminded that not every, you know, there's just a different level of response and different like length for that restriction, and as well approach from the typical consumer as to how they're viewing this and how it's affecting their spending habits. Because otherwise you'd be skewed to just think that everyone is as cautious as like the people you see in your neighborhood, right?
Yeah, because all of my reporting is local, I feel like I'm definitely locked into that bubble, except when I talk to friends and family members in other states and countries, and just that's when I really get a sense of the different experiences with it. And I have to say I'm grateful to be in New York City, where we learned those lessons and are being much more cautious now and not opening those indoor spaces, because we've seen what's happening in other states that did open those indoor spaces, those bars and where people weren't wearing masks back in May, and now they're really suffering. And you know, having friends and family members in other states and countries has been really interesting, but not reporting on anything outside of New York City. I feel like I am in a bubble, not being able to go anywhere. I feel like even more so. But it is interesting that New Yorkers are much, I feel like, just have had to take it much more seriously, just having those personal experiences where they know someone who has been very sick or died, or just seeing those refrigerator trucks full of bodies outside their window, or just, you know, having those personal, emotional connections to it, where people in other places, it just hasn't hit as close to home, but now it is. So yeah, there's definitely a big difference in that New York bubble.
Absolutely agreed. As I saw evidently back in March, drastic difference. This question is from Deyanira Martinez. Is media given credit or coverage to the various conspiracy theories of the virus that are being magnified, I guess, I suppose in places social media or even other media outlets? Kind of, I don't know, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I guess that the virus is a hoax, or that you can't necessarily catch it if you're a certain age. A way I can frame this question is, how are each of your individual newsrooms, or how are you, you know, kind of working to emphasize that obviously this is a very real virus and it has very real life consequences?
I feel like it was very difficult. Oh, sorry, Sonia, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Right, so I feel that it's very difficult at the local level for people to, and of course, anything is possible under the sun for people to think here in New York that this was a conspiracy, given how completely horrible the virus was in New York City, and how we all heard the sirens morning, afternoon, and night for weeks and months on end. We all saw the images of the trucks. We all heard stories from inside the hospitals. Like, I think it's difficult in many ways to kind of like understate the effect of the virus here in New York City. But of course, again, anything is possible under the sun. But I think it's really important that we as journalists like remain, as always, committed to the truth and to showing people, you know, just the straight up facts, you know, and analyzing the situation around all of this, because this is something that is affecting all of us. It's not something that we are seeing or reporting on. It's something that is happening to us. And, you know, just kind of elevating that coverage. And, you know, and when the situation comes, or when the situation arrives where we do have to kind of do some kind of like myth busting or fact checking on some sort of like viral conspiracy or like viral claim, like of the miracle cure for the virus is like finding, like taking an eyelash hair from the Bible or something like that, or something that's going viral on WhatsApp, like being able to just kind of like reach out to the community and saying like, no, this is not right. And in fact, these are the facts that you should be looking at, in a way that is, you know, kind of like humane and not trying to like shame people, just like kind of like engaging in good faith. Like, I think that's just really important skills for a reporter to have. And I think that we, you know, all exercise in many ways, whether or not we're in a pandemic.
A lot of the information we were getting about the virus at the very beginning was from local health officials, was from state and local health authorities, much more so than from the federal government at the very beginning. And I feel like a lot of that information just changed, it evolved. And so where we might have reported something and emphasized something that might have just changed, where we look back and say, oh, okay, that wasn't quite right. But I was reading something today that was just saying, well, that's the way science works. And we're seeing science in real time because scientists and the most educated and the best experts on communicable diseases are learning in real time right now. And so we all are. And so when that information changes, you know, we hear a lot of, well, you know, they said not to wear masks at the beginning, or the media reported this. Yeah, it's not because we were reckless. It's because things changed. And that's just the science of it.
Absolutely. I feel like this is one of those stories that's kind of hard to stay objective because it's impacting all of our lives in one way or another. But we do have to obviously stay loyal and true to the facts. This is another question from Christopher Alvarez. He says, I feel like this is for Janelle also, given that spending has been at rest, do you think amping up monetary policy is a question that should be brought up more?
So I'm not quite sure what is meant by amping up monetary policy. But I will say that the Fed has done a lot. They moved quickly, they cut rates to zero, and they then got very creative in their response, right? So normally interest rates are the main tool that the Federal Reserve has to stimulate the economy, because if they lower rates, then it becomes more affordable to borrow, to buy a home. And you know, these kinds of things are stimulating the economy a little bit. We are seeing people taking advantage of that and buying more homes, even though we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? So that's their main tool. But the Fed has also done a number of other things to keep credit markets from freezing up, right? So if you think about the markets that we rely on to get credit, to take out loans, it's all based on bonds trading. And if in the beginning, even the safest bonds, people were nervous to trade them because they didn't know what was going on. And so the Fed had to create a lot of different emergency lending tools and really complicated stuff that I'm not going to get into. But markets are now behaving a little bit better. I mean, but that doesn't mean that their approach is not being, like, there's still people who maybe think the Fed did too much or didn't do enough, right? So that's part of the analysis that I do in my work as well every day. As far as rates, they're already at zero. There's questions as to whether we can have them, if they should be going negative. That's something that was done in Europe, it was done in Japan. But over here, there's a lot of skepticism that it would work, both from the policymakers and from some of the people in the financial industry. So it's an interesting time to be covering the Fed, to be covering monetary policy. I mean, now when we have the meeting next week, when we cover it, it's not going to be so much about, well, what are you going to do to rates? Because it's pretty clear, like, rates are not going to come up because the economy is still suffering, right? So it becomes more of a subtle discussion as to, well, what are they watching for? What other tools might they bring out? And is it working what they're doing? Are people using it? Are people using these tools that they created? That's really where our stories are right now.
Great. Thank you so much for answering that, Janelle. So this is the final question before we wrap up. We're going to finish around 7:15 for everyone watching. A 6-month retrospective, what is that? We're just looking back at, since the first case of coronavirus hit the United States, kind of taking a pause and a breather and, centering ourselves. Like, okay, we're 6 months into, a pandemic that has hit the US. We've covered a lot and learned a lot as we've gone along as journalists, kind of writing and reporting out these stories. What advice would you give to some of our members that are watching that are either new journalists early on in their careers, of how to kind of continue to do the work or do it with accuracy and with care, that you've learned in the past 6 months as established reporters, each of you in your own right, of course. And what do you look forward to in the next 6 months, reporting wise, life wise, etc. That'll be our final question to wrap things up.
I can go ahead. So I feel that, like, looking back on the last 6 months and reflecting on, what this pandemic has been like and the role that we as reporters have played, as I said earlier, I feel that, like, this experience, speaking personally, has really put into focus the fact that what we're doing is a public service. And that, even though this is a topic that is overwhelming, and as Sonia mentioned, it's something that is changing every single day, just because the information and the knowledge of this is changing every single day. None of us have lived through something like this before. Like, no one on this earth has lived through something like this before. It's, taking lessons from past crises on the one hand, but on the other, it's not getting overwhelmed by the day-to-day in terms of, like, your craft and your job. Like, we play a very specific role in democracy, and when it comes to writing a story or sharing information, NBA, news background analysis, always be looking to contextualize what is going on to your readers and your audience around you, and to always try to kind of, like, shift, not just contextualizing, but giving them kind of like analysis, like a kernel of knowledge that they can take away and empower them, empower your audience, empower your readers, your viewers, your listeners into becoming, better informed and smarter about this thing that is affecting all of us. And, in the months and the weeks and months ahead, as in New York, we near the second wave, that's just something that I have in mind. And I certainly hope that we as reporters and we as kind of like the local News Corps have learned lessons, especially from the beginning of the pandemic, and that those lessons and that those takeaways will really come into focus the next time around. And that also, it's been, again, like, over the last 4 months of the pandemic in New York City, and kind of like 6 months of the pandemic in the US, it's been, it's been, an incredible honor to just ask tough questions on behalf of New Yorkers, and, to kind of, like, it's a cliche, but to speak truth to power, and to shine a light on things that maybe we'll probably get lost in the fold as we cover kind of like the crazy frenzy of this situation and this issue day by day. It's been very gratifying. And it's not an experience that I will ever forget in my career.
I think because we're using social media so much more than we did before, like we discussed earlier, it's been really harder to keep your ear to the ground in the way that you did before. And that would, so I guess just being able to really not discount some of the things that you're hearing from the people in your own social network, people you trust, not just conspiracy theories, obviously, but from your own trusted network, to really try to get a real variety of perspectives so that you get a balance of what's going on, even if it's not something that you necessarily agree with, or not a perspective that you think might be as important. It will become more important, and to just not discount those different perspectives that you see on social media. And again, it's harder to connect in the way that we were used to before, and that's kind of replaced that. But I feel like so many things, little cues and little red flags and things that I could have noticed earlier, from just different people I follow, or people in, again, trusted people in my network. I wish I had kind of paid attention to different things at different times.
Mm-hmm. I guess I would say that one of the main takeaways from this experience has been that you should trust your sense of curiosity and your perspective. Who would have known that, like, these workers, like people like Claudia mentioned, like janitors, service workers, probably people that you know as well because of your background, that they would become the center of this pandemic, this experience. So I think it's a big reminder to think about what you're seeing in your community and in your family, and if that's something that other people are seeing too and would relate to around the country or around the city. So as things progress, to trust your perspective. And another thing that's surprised me was, we went into this year thinking, oh, the election is going to be the main thing. And then what happens, right? Pandemic, huge focus now on race relations, really important issues. And the election is still in the background. I think though we're getting closer to it, it's gonna become maybe more a central point of our coverage as the date approaches. So I'm looking forward to that part of things too. Holding the candidates and their policies accountable and finding ways in to tell those stories over the next 6 months, whatever they look like.
Absolutely. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives. And to wrap up, I want to thank Sonia, Claudia, and Janelle for joining us and giving us their time, their insight. We're very grateful to have had all three of you. We're also going to have each of you share either your social media handle, your Twitter, wherever, so people can keep up with the stories that you guys are reporting. So we can start with Claudia.
Yeah, so yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. I tweet way too much. It's at Clau Irizarry, so CLAUIRI, Z as in zebra, ARRY.
Janelle?
So I put it in the chat too, I think, or maybe that was just to the panelists, but I'll put it in the attendees. My Twitter handle is just my first name. So it's JONNELLE.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to be adding them in the chat as well. Sonia?
My Twitter handle is just my first and last name, Sonia Rincon. And I probably don't tweet enough. I'm probably just there lurking too much and not actually sharing enough. I should share more.
Okay, perfect. Thank you once again. And if you joined us late, the full panel is going to be available on the NAHJ YouTube channel. We're also going to share it on the NAHJ New York City social media accounts. So be sure to look there. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you for having us.
I look forward to reading all of your stories. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.